There's a moment, and it happens fast, when 10,000 people are locked into a single rhythm, a single voice, a single man under a white spotlight. And then something breaks. Not on stage, in the seats. A ripple, a shift in attention, a cluster of heads turning away from the stage towards something happening 3 or 4 rows deep. Someone is down, a woman, maybe overheated, maybe overwhelmed, maybe something worse. The people nearest to her are standing, waving, trying to get someone's attention. Security, a medic, anyone. And the man on stage, the man everyone else is watching, notices. Elvis Presley was mid-song, mid-set, mid-performance in a touring schedule that by the early to mid-1970s had become relentless. City after city, arena after arena, the same songs rearranged slightly, the same jumpsuits growing heavier, the same crowds pressing forward with the same desperate need to be close to him. But this show didn't continue the same way, not because of a technical failure, not because of a protest or a disruption, because a single person in the audience needed help, and the performer on stage, the one the world had turned into a symbol, a product, a myth, responded not as an icon, but as a man who was still watching. What happened next wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a grand rescue. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more revealing. The tone shifted. The setlist and the wall between performer and audience, the one that fame and spectacle had been building around Elvis for 20 years, cracked open for a few minutes. And the show that followed was not the show that had been planned. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what it cost Elvis Presley to be on that stage in the first place, and what it meant that he was still, after everything, paying attention to the room. By the time Elvis Presley returned to live performing in 1969, he hadn't played a proper concert in nearly 8 years.
The '68 comeback special had reminded the world, and reminded Elvis, that the stage was where he was most alive. But the stage he returned to was different. It was Las Vegas. It was showrooms and residencies and 2 shows a night. It was controlled, contained, monetized. And then came the tours. Starting in 1970 and accelerating through the years that followed, Elvis began crisscrossing the country, sometimes playing 4 or 5 cities in a week. The operation was massive. The TCB Band, the Sweet Inspirations, the Stamps Quartet, comedian Jackie Kahane opening, a fleet of equipment trucks and security personnel, Colonel Tom Parker's promotional machinery running at full capacity. From the outside, it looked like triumph, sold-out arenas, standing ovations, the king back among his people. From the inside, it was more complicated. Elvis was, by multiple accounts from musicians and crew members who traveled with him, a performer who never fully disconnected from his audience. This wasn't a figure who walked on stage, hit his marks, delivered the hits, and walked off. He talked to the crowd. He made jokes. He introduced band members with elaborate, sometimes rambling affection. He took scarves from around his neck and handed them to women in the front rows. He kissed fans. He acknowledged signs. He noticed things. Jerry Schilling, one of the Memphis Mafia's inner circle, would later reflect on how Elvis had a peculiar awareness of the energy in a room, not just the adulation, but the tension, the fatigue, the moments when something felt off. Guitarist James Burton and other TCB band members have spoken in interviews about how Elvis would sometimes shift a set list mid-show based on what he was feeling from the audience, slowing things down when the room felt restless, leaning into gospel when the energy needed grounding. This wasn't sentimentality, it was instinct.
And it was also, in a way that became more visible as the 1970s wore on, a kind of emotional exposure, because the man who watched the room was also the man the room was watching. And by the mid-70s, what the room saw was changing. The weight, the perspiration, the moments of breathlessness between songs, the occasional slurred word, the jumpsuits that had to be redesigned to accommodate a body under siege. Elvis on stage in 1975 or 1976 was not Elvis on stage in 1970, but the attention, that raw, almost compulsive attention to the people in front of him, that had not disappeared. Which is why, when something went wrong in the crowd, Elvis didn't simply perform through it. He couldn't. It wasn't in him. The documented instances of fans collapsing or experiencing medical emergencies during Elvis concerts are not singular. They occurred with some regularity across the touring years. Packed arenas, intense heat from stage lighting and body density, emotional overwhelm, physical exhaustion from hours of waiting. These were environments that produced medical incidents, and Elvis's security teams and venue staff were generally prepared for them. But what distinguished certain shows, what made certain nights linger in the memories of the band, the crew, and the fans who were present, was how Elvis himself responded when he became aware that someone in the audience was in distress. The pattern, drawn from concert attendee accounts, band member recollections, and in some cases audio recordings from the era, was consistent enough to be considered characteristic rather than anecdotal. Elvis would notice the disturbance, sometimes mid-song, sometimes between numbers. He would pause, not dramatically, not performatively, but with a visible shift in focus. His eyes would move from the general sweep of the audience to a specific point. He would ask into the microphone or to someone off stage whether the person was being helped.
He might direct security or medical staff toward the location. In some instances, he asked the audience nearby to give the person space. And then he would continue, but not the same way. The set list would bend. A high-energy number might give way to something slower. A ballad might arrive earlier than planned. The jokes between songs might soften or disappear entirely. The temperature of the performance, that intangible thing that separates a routine show from a meaningful one, would shift towards something more intimate. On at least one well-documented occasion, Elvis dedicated the next song to the person who had collapsed, asking the audience to keep them in their thoughts. On others, he simply let the moment pass without direct comment, but adjusted his energy in a way that the band could feel. James Burton has described moments like these as times when Elvis came back into the room, meaning that the larger-than-life performance persona would recede slightly, and the man underneath would become more visible. The band would follow his lead. The rhythm section would pull back. The backing vocals would soften. The show would become less of a spectacle and more of a conversation. What the audience experienced in those minutes was not a disruption. It was a revelation. The wall between the stage and the seats, the wall that fame, mythology, and 20 years of being the most recognized human being on the planet had built, became, for a few moments, transparent. Elvis Presley, standing under the lights in a jeweled jumpsuit, was not performing concern. He was feeling it, and the room could tell. The show continued. It always continued, but it continued differently. The energy never quite returned to where it had been before the collapse, not because the audience lost interest, but because they had seen something they didn't expect to see. They had seen Elvis, not the icon, not the brand, not the myth, but the man.
And that man was worried about a stranger. These moments almost never made the newspapers. They didn't appear in Colonel Parker's promotional materials. They weren't featured in the concert films or the official recordings. The machinery of Elvis's career, the machinery that had been running since 1955, was designed to project power, spectacle, and invincibility. A fan collapsing in the audience and the star pausing to make sure they were okay didn't fit the narrative, but it fit the man. And this is where the gap between the Elvis of public mythology and the Elvis of private reality becomes most visible. Not in the Graceland stories, not in the Memphis Mafia recollections, not in the divorce proceedings or the prescription records, but on stage, in real time, in front of thousands of people, when something unexpected happened and the mask slipped. Because Elvis Presley's relationship with his audience was never simple. It was, in many ways, the most honest relationship he had. The people around him, the entourage, the management, the film studios, the record labels, all wanted something from him. They wanted product. They wanted compliance. They wanted the brand to continue functioning. Even the people who genuinely loved him, Priscilla, Lisa Marie, his father Vernon, his closest friends, existed in a gravitational field so distorted by fame that normal human connection was almost impossible. But the audience, the crowd, the anonymous mass of people who bought tickets and stood in line and screamed and cried and reached toward the stage, they wanted only one thing, to be in the same room with him. And Elvis, for all the ways fame had damaged him, never stopped wanting to be in the same room with them. This is what made the fan collapse moment so telling. They exposed a truth that the official Elvis narrative had no use for, that the man on stage was not performing invulnerability. He was performing connection. And when that connection was threatened, when a human being in his audience was in danger, he could not simply keep singing as though nothing had happened. The contrast with other performers of the era is worth noting, not to diminish anyone, but to clarify what made Elvis's response distinctive. Large-scale touring in the 1970s was an industrial operation. Shows ran on schedules, set lists were planned. The expectation, generally, was that medical incidents in the crowd were handled by venue staff while the show continued uninterrupted. That was the professional norm. Elvis broke the norm, not with grand gestures, not with theatrical displays of compassion, but with small, real, human adjustments that the audience could feel, even if they couldn't fully articulate what had changed. The show didn't stop, but it bent, and in the bending, something true was revealed. In the final years of Elvis Presley's touring life, 1976-1977, the concerts became increasingly unpredictable. Some nights were transcendent, some were difficult to watch. The voice, when it was there, was still extraordinary, deeper, more weathered, capable of emotional textures that the young Elvis could never have reached. But the body was failing, the discipline was fraying, the isolation was deepening. And yet, the attention to the audience, that instinct, that compulsion, that need to watch the room and respond to it, never fully left him. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to turn this into a sentimental narrative, to say that Elvis's concern for a collapsed fan proves he was secretly fine, secretly whole, secretly the good man the myth wanted him to be. That's not what this story is about. What this story is about is something more honest and more painful, that Elvis Presley, even as his own life was collapsing, was still capable of noticing when someone else was in trouble. That the same man who could not save himself from the prescription drugs, the loneliness, the contractual prison, the physical deterioration, that man could still stop a show, or bend a show, or change the direction of a performance, because a stranger in the 15th row needed help. That is not a comfortable truth. It is not a redemptive truth. It is a human truth. The concerts from the touring years, all of them, the great ones and the difficult ones, exist now as audio recordings, fragments of film, and the memories of the people who were there. The official record captures the songs, the arrangements, the applause. What it rarely captures are the moments between the songs, the pauses, the asides, the shifts in energy that told you something had happened in the room that wasn't on the set list. The fan who collapsed, whichever fan, whichever night, whichever city, recovered or didn't, was taken to a hospital or walked out on their own, and almost certainly never appeared in any official account of the evening. They were a footnote to the spectacle, an interruption. But to Elvis, in that moment, they were the most important person in the room. And that is what changed the show. Not the collapse itself, but the fact that the man on stage, the most famous performer alive, the man trapped inside his own legend, still had the capacity to let a single human being's crisis matter more than the performance. The concert didn't continue the same way. It couldn't, because for a few minutes, the show had become something it was never designed to be. It had become real. And real, in the life of Elvis Presley, in the architecture of fame, in the machinery of myth, was the one thing no one had planned for.